Tech Nuggets, Firewalls, and pfSense 2. So we're going to go back and look at pfSense again because there were certain things we did in our earlier pfSense Fireball that we just sort of took the defaults and didn't really look at any of the advanced features. And to get a feel for how to do a more enterprise-style network firewall layout, we're going to go back and look at some advanced features. So we're going to look at things like, well, what happens when my ISP assigns me a static IP address? How do I configure the WAN side? What if I don't want to use the stock 192.168 on the LAN side? What if I've got other, interfaces and IP addresses I want to use? So we're going to go through interface config and how to set up interfaces and set up gateways on those interfaces and things like that. We're also going to look at routing. If you're a larger corporation, you probably have an assignment of some static IPs that you want to bring into your DMZ, and I want to set up some level of routing that goes with that kind of stuff. So pfSense offers a routing. Remember, pfSense is a router with the ability to say no. That's what makes it a firewall. So routing is going to be part of that kind of setup, and we'll look at the routing interface that goes with that. It's, again, part of the web interface. We'll also look at NAT. Again, in our previous iteration, we just sort of took the standard NAT features on the LAN side where it handled all of it. We didn't really have to do anything. Sometimes we don't want any NAT. Other times we're going to want it to NAT, but we want it to NAT a specific way. So we'll go in and look at the different NAT settings that go with that. Additionally, there are packages that are available, add-on packages for pfSense. There's a spot in pfSense where you can go and say, hey, I need additional functionality. And this functionality can be created either by the pfSense people, and they don't load it by default, or it can be added by community members that are avid pfSense users and see a need and create it and offer it out in their sort of app store of places you can go download it and get it. And one of these is going to be OSPF, where we want our pfSense to participate in the enterprise OSPF community. And so I've added here the link so that you can go read and look at the what the documentation says about their OSPF offering. And we'll talk about how to add that package in and do that kind of stuff. At the end here, I've added DMZ because I want to have a brief discussion when it comes to our practical demo about how this is going to be set up. So let's flip to the diagram here, and you can see I've got our layered security model at the top. We've got our outside world client with an ISP that hits a pfSense exterior firewall. And then we head into the DMZ, which is set up on 10.105.80.254, and that's our DMZ network. And then we hit a pfSense interior, which has 172.30.128.0. For the purposes of our demo, we're going to need to assume that 10.105.80.0/24 is publicly routable space. I realize it's not due to the limitations that I have on how much public space I can assign to different places. We're going to just, for the purposes of the exercise, assume that 10.105.80.0/24 is publicly routable space, even though it's really not. And this will have some effects on how we set up some of our pfSense, but it'll work for the most part for what we need. So what we're seeing here is a layered security model, right? I've got two pfSenses that work in community to allow outside world client into the DMZ to the web server, but we'll use the second interior one to block anything to allow anything into the secure client network, which is what we don't want. Several people have asked, well, can't you just have multiple interfaces on one pfSense and I can manage it all in one place? And that is true, and in small instances we might do that. In our previous firewall example, that is exactly what we did. We just had a separate interface that went off and was the DMZ, and secure clients were on one side. And the only problem with that is when that single point of failure either fails or gets hacked, everything goes with it, and that can be very bad. So if we use poor password policies and our one exterior facing pfSense gets hacked, or there's a 0-day bug, God forbid, in pfSense, it could be leveraged rather rapidly that way. So we tend to go with a tiered, layered security model where exterior pfSense is going to only worry about how does the outside world get to the DMZ, and interior pfSense will worry about how do I keep everything out except the secure clients that need out, and maybe things from DMZ that need back in, but not really the outside world in. So we'll have a layered security kind of approach. And again, when we set those things up in the real world, we'll want to make sure that the interior and exterior pfSenses have different passwords, and we'll want to keep those in mind when we do that kind of stuff. For our practical demo here, we may not do that, but in the real world context, we'll absolutely want to keep that in mind. All right, let's head on to our practical demonstration. All right, so what you can see here is that I've gotten the basic network diagram set up. Now I've added an extra element here, which is my laptop object, which is a Ubuntu GUI, and that way I can have a web browser, and I can have CLI, and I can get to a variety of different things that needed to, configure pfSense like we've done in the previous Firewall lab. So I'll be using that in a little bit. We're going to talk first about how to set up and configure interfaces, because that's what we got to do. A lot of that can be done at the command line, so we can go look at the console. And in some ways, it's actually easier to set it there than it is to fight your way through the GUI for interface kind of stuff. So you can do some basic interface setup. And you'll see here, I've got pfSense exterior and pfSense interior on the top and the bottom. So we're going to set the exterior interface, so we're going to click on it, and we're going to set the interface, so 2, right? And it's going to ask us, which one do I want to set up? And we're going to say, I want to set up the WAN, and it's going to want to know, nope, don't want to use DHCP, since we have an IP address on our diagram, and we are 132.235.160.222/26. And it wants to know, what's my upstream gateway for the WAN? So who does pfSense talk to give its packets to? So 235.160.254. Oops, typo. 235.160.254. All right, so that's our gateway that gets us out. And are we going to configure a v6 address? If we needed to, then yes, we would need to. In my case, I'm not doing anything with v6, but you might be, and this would be the place where you might do that kind of stuff. DHCP v6 is a way of handing out IPv6 addresses. There's of course IPv6 PD, Slack, stuff like that. Your mileage may vary. You may need to read the manual if you need to figure that kind of stuff out. I'm going to say no, since I don't have any of that. You can put in a static if you've got one. I don't have a static, so we're going to revert to HTTP as web configurator protocol. We'll just say yes to that. It'll set it up so that it's using the web interface to allow us to get in at it from the LAN side. And you can see it's gone through its restart process. And when I hit enter, now when we look up here at the top, we'll see that it's set up a correct out, and we can test it, right? So one of the options here is ping. So we should be able to get to the outside world at this point. So we can hit 7, and we can ping somebody. And there we go. You can see I've set up my IP address and my gateway, and I can ping somebody. I could have pinged my gateway, which would probably have been the safe answer, but we went whole hog and just pinged Google, which worked. All right, so at this point, we've got it set up. We can do the same thing on the LAN side when we want to set up LAN interfaces. They're going to work the same way, right? We're going to set ourselves up with the addresses from our diagram. So I will go do that and come back. So I thought about it for a second and said, no, I probably really should go through the process of setting up our internal interface as well, because it has some effects, right? When I'm using my laptop over here and I connect in through the web interface, I'm actually using the IP address that I then want to change. So that can be kind of confusing when you cut your nose off to spite your face. So, even more than your WAN, setting your LAN interface at the console might be the easiest way. And again, we go to set interfaces, and it asks us what we want to set, and we say 2, and we're going to give it our address that's on the diagram. So we're going to be 10.105.80.254/24, right? We're the gateway out to the rest of the world, so we would be the last usable address in the space. And for an upstream gateway, we don't have to give it anything for LAN. It's going to know, since we gave the other side a gateway out, that's the default gateway. We don't want to give the LAN a gateway. We just hit enter for none, and it will proceed on to the WAN side as its default gateway that way. So if we had a v6 address, we'd use it here. This is where it gets fun. We do want to enable DHCP in a lot of cases, right? We want to do DHCP on the inside. You don't have to. If you're going to statically route or statically assign everything, you don't have to. But if you want a DHCP, this is where it would get fun, because if you were doing it through the laptop, you'd have an IP address from the old subnet and from the old DHCP server. And this will let you reconfigure it without having to worry about that. So we'll say yes, and it'll ask, where's the beginning of the range? So, this is one of those art kind of questions, and we're going to set ours to be 10.105.80.50 as the beginning of the range. And it's going to ask, where's the end of the range? 10.105.80.100. So we're going to use from 80 to 100, an inclusive range, as our DHCP. It's probably wildly bigger than we're ever going to use, but sometimes it's nice to have that. It at least lets us plug our laptop in, configured for DHCP, get an IP, and be able to be in the DMZ like anybody else and do that kind of stuff. So it won't be such a big deal. So it will go through and restart DHCP and reconfigure it all and that kind of stuff. And you can see here it's telling us, hey, the website for how to web configure pfSense has moved, and it gives the new IP address for that. So when you look up here, you can see that the new IP address is 10.105.80.254. So if I go to my laptop and look, and we go to laptop and look, currently my IP address, because it was plugged in before, will probably be a 192 address, because it probably hasn't changed over yet. Right, it's still 192.168.1.2.102, which isn't going to do me any good. So we want to cycle the interface to make sure that it picks up a new DHCP, right? So we're going to go in, we're going to flip the interface off, we're going to flip it back on, it's going to pick up a new interface, or pick up a new IP address, because it'll redo DHCP. And that's what we want. That way we can get to the web interface to do a variety of the other tasks that we're going to do. So we go in and look, and now I get 10.105.80.50. Ta-da! It's got to give it a chance to cycle it. If you're going to do that kind of thing, you're going to need to take your laptop machine down and back up again, and that'll let you get at things you need to get at that are in the end. So when configuring interfaces, oftentimes it's easier to do with the console than it is to do in the web interface. You can do it at the web interface. You just have to know that, whoops, I've changed the IP to that interface that I was using, and then you have to go redo it all manually, but it's a lot more academic in your head. Knowing you can do it on the console makes it a little bit easier. All right, so now that we've got that set up, let's go into the web interface, since we've done all the interface configuring, and that's all we really need to get to the web interface. And that'll allow us to go in. So we said we were 10.105.80. What did we say? 254, right? Because we're the gateway. So we're able to go in, and it's going to want us to log in. So it's a standard stock, right out of the box kind of thing. So it's going to be admin and pfSense. And it's, I usually say don't save, because, that's evil. You don't want to save passwords in browsers. And it's going to want to go through the intro. So I will very quickly whiz through this. You've done this previously, so it's not usually a big deal. It'll ask things. Since we don't have that here, we can probably give it DNS servers. If you're running your own DNS server, you may need to refer to it. You can refer to outside ones if you want, that kind of thing. This is a good place to do that. Time servers and all that kind of good stuff. You're going to see some of your own configuration in here that we already did. We already went through and did that. And if we had access to it, this is going to be really important. This is RFC 1918. Now, for our 10.105.80 or whatever addresses, it's going to block these from coming in, or it may block them from coming in. So we're going to want to uncheck both of these to make sure that our clients that exist out here on Outside World Client can come in through the WAN interface and access web servers or whatever's in our DMZ as if the 10.105 network were a real network. So we want to make sure we check those boxes. And we can go back. If we missed it here, it's on the interface, and I'll show you where that is. We'll look at the web-based interface configuration. We can do that. You see we have the LAN interface. We go through and configure it here. We do that kind of stuff. And it wants us to set a new password, which I will set to our appropriate password that we use in class. And we'll go and reload it. And I will pause while this thing reloads itself and come right back. All right, so the wizard has completed here and it's ready to go. So we hit finish and it should drop us at the main prompt here. A lot of this should be review from our previous firewall lab that we did. and we can see that WAN and LAN are up, and that we give it some IP addresses and things like that, and we can get some basic stats as to what's going on. If I want to configure interfaces, or I need to change the IP addresses for some reason, I come up to the interfaces, pull down, I can go to WAN, we can look at all the same settings that were in the wizard, we can change it to be static in v4, and we can come down and do v6, and we can do static, and all those options that were in there that we saw as part of the wizard or part of the console are here. So sometimes it's nice to just get the basics set up in the console and then come in and see all the choices in your web interface. And you'll notice it's created us an upstream gateway already. So sometimes we need multiple gateways. And you'll also notice down here at the bottom are the two checkboxes I was just talking about with the blocking of private addresses. And you can hit save and it'll go save it. Since we didn't change anything, I'm not going to bother. Again, you can see the same thing for LAN. You can see it's enabled and all of its different settings and things like that. These by default, I believe, are unchecked. I didn't have to check the LAN ones because they assume the LAN side is going to be that way. If you add multiple interfaces for some reason, you might want to check those boxes to make sure they're set correctly. So let's go on and talk about routing. So just in the typical standard, how do I set up a static route? We go to System, we go to Routing. It'll show us kind of all the standard things. And the interesting thing with the web interface is with routing, we often need to know where we're going. What's the gateway? So we can set up gateways separately from the routes. And you can see here, this one got created when I created the static route. It's a default route, right? So it even says default. And that got set up when I created the interface and changed the interfaces around. So you can go to static routes here, and I can create additional routes. And if I hit add, oftentimes where is it going? What gateway is it using? If I need to define the gateway, I may need to go create the gateway first and then, go create the route. So a lot of times when we're using Voios or we're using other things, we say this network to that IP address. This network is defined here. That IP address would be a gateway. So where is it going to leave is a gateway out of the network. We can also disable them if we just need to turn it off for some reason to test it, and we can give it an English language description, or I suppose any language description. So in some ways it's a little backwards for what we're used to, where we do it at the command line, where we put in, the network I want to route and where's it going, next hop. Gateway in this context is next hop, but we have to define the next hop first, which is a little weird, right? We go to routing and we can look at our gateways here. These are all the next hops. And we may have to, if we have multiple interfaces or something like that, we may need to define the next hop first and then go and define the route to the next hop that way. All right, so natting. So natting is one of those things that, again, gets set up with our LAN side connection, so we can go in and look at it and play with it. The interface for pfSense has things in interesting places, and in this case, natting is done as part of the Firewall menu. I don't really consider it part of the Firewall, but it is part of the Firewall menu, and you can see it here under Firewall and NAT. So we go pull it up, and we can see a variety of interesting things. We don't actually start out in what I would have considered the traditional NAT portion. This is where we would do port forwarding. If we go to outbound NAT, we can begin to see a little bit more what's going on, and we can come down here and see that these auto-created rules were created when we did the interface configuration for the LAN side, and it said, hey, we need to do this stuff. So we can see down here, we've got some rules, and our 10.105 80.0/24 is getting natted through our WAN address, and we can see some of that kind of stuff going on here. So we can set up automatic NAT. We can do some hybrid NAT where it's both automatic and manual. Generally speaking, the NATs that I have set up in the past, I have disabled outbound NAT rule generation automatically, which allows me to come in here and manually create those kinds of things where I can go in and say, hey, I want to create a mapping, and I can say what interface am I natting through and what address family am I using and what's my source network and my destination network. So in our case, it would have looked like this, right? We would have done something like that, and we would have natted the entire range. And if you've got other ranges on other interfaces, you may need to come in and set those kinds of things up as you go along. You could go in and do some of that via the, when you set up the interface, especially if you do it in the console, it probably will ask you if you want to set up DHCP, and it will probably automatically create those NAT rules. So you can look at those. You can, of course, look at the NAT rules that exist already that were created here. The last thing we're going to talk about is really kind of two things rolled to one. So sometimes we have options that aren't natively supported in pfSense, but there is a way to get outside packages, and we can go to Package Manager here, which is a web-based package manager, and we can go look for available packages. Now, in our case, I'm going to go look for OSPF, and I'm going to search for it, and it's going to find it. And we've got a couple of different options. The Quagga OSPF one, Quagga is the name of the daemon that runs underneath the hood, and we click install, and it will go out and download it, install it, and that kind of thing. And we can see here it's going to chug away. And Quagga is the engine that we've used. If you're familiar with Voyos, Voyos uses Quagga to do a lot of that kind of stuff under the hood. It's a package that's been around. Someone took it and bundled it up and got it ready here for use in pfSense, and it will create the web menus and things like that when it's done installing. So I will pause this and let it install. It takes a few minutes. It's not super long or anything, but it does take a little bit. And then we'll go back and look at the interface for OSPF. All right, so we can see here that it's finished its installing. It created a bunch of groups and installed all of its stuff. And you can see success here at the end, which is what we want. And if we go back to available package, we should now see it installed. And it'll take a minute here to generate its list of things that it has. And there you go. You uninstall it or refresh it if you need to reinstall it or something like that. And it'll show its dependencies. There's a whole variety of great packages that exist. Highly recommend you have a look through it. You can do all sorts of fun stuff with it. There's all sorts of bind and cron and all sorts of great stuff that lives in here that you can do with it. You can make it a web proxy, and you can do Nmap from it, and it does all sorts of interesting things if you needed to do that kind of thing. I'm going to flip here real quickly to the web page for OSPF. This is from Netgate, is the company that makes pfSense, and this is the same link that I had in the slides, and it talks about how to install OSPF and a little about how to do some of that kind of stuff. And there's a example here of how to do OpenVPN and that kind of stuff, and you can see it's got multiple pfSense boxes doing OSPF in between the two and that kind of stuff to try to figure it all out. So there's an example you can look at and that kind of thing. If we hop back to here, we can find that they have added some things to our interfaces, I believe. Nope. There it is. It's under services. I apologize. So we can see Quagga OSPF D. The little lowercase d means for daemon, which is a program that runs all the time. So we can set a variety of things, right? We've got router IDs, and these things ought to look fairly similar from when we did OSPF in Voyos. And you may not use all of them, and that's okay. Up at the top, we've got interface settings so that we can add interface settings and descriptions and things like that, and where are we doing it and what's it doing and that kind of stuff. Some level of being able to read the manual would be helpful. I would be very surprised if you got to this part. This is how you would do actual raw configuration. Several people asked about doing pfSense command line. This is the equivalent to that. And we can, of course, go to status once we get it allegedly configured and look at what's going on. So we can see who our neighbors are, and it will go and show us those kinds of things as we go on and what it's doing. Well, that will wrap up this Tech Nugget. I hope you've learned a lot about some advanced features in pfSense, and we look forward to seeing you for the next one.